I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office, catching up on the bank balance and wondering if the price of oil shale stocks was going to do something interesting or just continue to sit there and pout when the front door segment of my life started to hum. It was 5:58 p.m. In the brownstone, time is not a suggestion, it's a religion. From 4 to 6, Nero Wolfe is up in the plant rooms with Theodore Horstman, playing nursemaid to 10,000 orchids and pretending the rest of the world doesn't exist. If you try to interrupt him during those 2 hours, you'd better be bearing news of a national invasion or a brand new species of odontoglossum. Even then, he'd probably make you wait until the clock struck 6. The doorbell rang. It wasn't the usual polite ID like to sell you something ring, or the frantic "the cops are behind me" jab. It was a long, steady, entitled press that suggested the person on the other side owned the stoop and was considering buying the rest of the street. I went to the front door, slid the bolt, and looked through the grilled window. Standing there was a man who looked like he had been put together by an expensive tailor and then left out in a very high-pressure wind tunnel. He was mid-50s, with hair the color of a galvanized bucket and eyes that looked like they had spent the last decade staring at spreadsheets and finding them wanting. "Yes?" I asked through the glass. "My name is Lewis Hewitt," he said. I blinked. Lewis Hewitt wasn't just a name, he was the man who had once gifted Wolfe 3 black orchids after a particularly messy business involving a greenhouse and a corpse. He was one of the few people Wolfe considered an equal, mostly because Hewitt had enough money to treat horticulture as a blood sport. "Mr. Hewitt," I said, swinging the door open. "Step in. Mr. Wolfe is still with the plants, but he'll be down in 2 minutes, unless you've brought more orchids, in which case he might come down in 1. Hewitt didn't smile. He stepped into the hallway, trailing the scent of expensive tobacco and genuine panic. "I haven't brought flowers, Archie. I've brought a catastrophe. We've had those before," I told him, taking his hat. "Usually they come with a retainer. You want to wait in the office. I've got some cold beer, or if you're feeling more formal, I can stir up some of the bourbon." "Bourbon," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Double." I led him into the office. I like the office. It's got a desk for me, a desk for Wolfe that looks like it was carved out of a single piece of a very old, very stubborn mountain, and enough books to keep a librarian busy for a century. I went to the cabinet, poured a generous portion of the amber stuff, and handed it to him. He downed half of it before his rear end even hit the red leather chair. At exactly 6:00 p.m., the sound of the elevator groaned through the house. A moment later, the door slid open, and the mountain itself emerged. Nero Wolfe, 1/7 of a ton of genius and stubbornness, entered the room. He was wearing his afternoon yellow silk shirt, which always makes him look like an oversized canary with a grudge. He saw Hewitt and stopped. His eyebrows went up a millimeter, the equivalent of a normal man doing a backflip. "Lewis," Wolfe said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. "You are early for dinner." "I am not here for dinner, Nero," Hewitt said, his hands shaking as he set the glass down. "Well, I am, but not the one we planned for next week. I need you, at my estate, tonight." Wolfe crossed the room, navigated the space behind his desk, and lowered himself into his custom-built chair with a sigh of relief. "Tonight is Friday. Fritz is preparing canard à l'orange. I do not leave home on Fridays. I rarely leave the house on any day ending in Y if I can avoid it. Nero, listen to me." Hewitt leaned forward. "I have a guest. A man named Victor Sanborn. He's a financier, a man of difficult reputation. He arrived this afternoon to discuss a merger involving my textile holdings. We were to have dinner at 8, then have it," Wolfe said, picking up a gold-plated letter opener and inspecting it for dust. "I fail to see how my presence improves a textile merger." "He's dead," Hewitt whispered. Wolfe didn't look up. "Then the merger will be significantly quieter. Call the police." "I can't," Hewitt said, his voice dropping even lower. "He died in my conservatory while he was alone. But Nero, he died holding a pair of my pruning shears. And he wasn't just stabbed. He was poisoned. I saw the discoloration on his face. If the police come now, they'll see a man killed in a locked room with my tools and my chemicals. My reputation, the Hewitt name, is sturdy enough to withstand a scandal, Wolfe finished. Archie, why is Mr. Hewitt still holding an empty glass? I moved to refill it, but I was watching Wolfe. He was doing that thing with his lips pushing them out and pulling them in, rhythmic and steady. He was thinking, not about the death probably, but about the fact that Hewitt owned a rare collection of Albuca that Wolfe had been eyeing for 3 years. You say poisoned, Wolfe muttered. What makes you so certain? The scent, Hewitt said. Bitter almonds. It was thick in the air. And Sanborn, he didn't just fall. He looked like he had been struck by lightning. Wolfe leaned back. The chair creaked in protest. A guest dies before dessert. A host with a motive of textile holdings. A locked conservatory. It is a cliché, Lewis. It is beneath you. It's not a cliché if I'm the one they arrest, Hewitt cried. Wolfe looked at me. Archie. Check the weather. Clear skies, boss, I said. A little chilly, but the sedan is glued up and ready to roll. Wolfe closed his eyes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated suffering. Very well. Lewis, you will pay me a ridiculous amount. Not because I need it, but because I am being forced to abandon my dinner. Archie, tell Fritz we are going to the country, and bring your shoulder holster. If Mr. Sanborn was poisoned in a locked room, the person who locked it is likely still on the premises, and I doubt they'll be happy to see us. I headed for the kitchen, feeling a grin tugging at my mouth. A dead financier, a panicked millionaire, and Nero Wolfe being forced to skip a meal. It was going to be a long night. The drive to Lewis Hewitt's estate in Westchester was conducted in a silence so thick you could have sliced it and served it with a side of horseradish. Wolfe sat in the back of the black sedan, his massive frame displaced across the leather seat like a continental plate shifting toward an unwanted destination. He didn't speak, he didn't look at the scenery, and he certainly didn't acknowledge Hewitt, who sat up front with me, twitching every time I hit a minor pothole. Wolfe hates cars. He considers any motion not powered by his own legs or a reliable elevator to be a direct affront to his dignity and a personal gamble with Providence. When we finally pulled through the wrought-iron gates of the Hewitt Manor, the moon was doing its best to make the place look like a Gothic stage set. It was a sprawling stone pile that suggested the owner had more money than he knew what to do with, and a deep-seated fear of ever running out of guest rooms. I parked the sedan near the main entrance, and it took Wolfe a good 30 seconds to negotiate his exit from the back seat. He stood on the gravel, adjusted his coat with a sharp tug, and glared at the house as if it had personally insulted his tailor. "The conservatory," Wolfe said, his voice clipped. It wasn't a request. Hewitt led the way, bypassing the grand foyer where a butler who looked like he'd been carved from a block of ice stood guard. We moved through a series of darkened hallways, the air growing warmer and more humid as we approached the glass-walled wing of the house. Even before Hewitt opened the heavy oak doors, I caught a whiff of its heavy, sweet scent of damp earth and tropical blooms, underscored by something sharp and metallic that didn't belong in a garden. The conservatory was a masterpiece of glass and steel, filled with enough greenery to choke a jungle. In the center of the room, sprawled across a path of white marble chips, was Victor Sanborn. He was face down, one arm outstretched toward a bank of rare ferns. In his hand, clutched with the grip of a man who had been surprised by eternity, was a pair of long-handled pruning shears. Wolfe didn't go near the body. He stopped 10 feet away, his nostrils flaring. He doesn't like corpses. He finds them untidy and intellectually stagnant. I, on the other hand, went over and knelt. Sanborn had been a big man in life, the kind of guy who probably ate smaller financiers for breakfast. But in death, he looked shrunken. His face, turned to the side, was a mottled, unnatural shade of violet red. "Don't touch the shears, Archie," Wolfe warned. "I wasn't planning on it," I said, looking at the victim's eyes. They were wide and staring, reflecting the moonlight hitting the glass ceiling above. Mr. Hewitt wasn't kidding about the scent. It's fading, but there's a definite trace of bitter almonds. Cyanide, fast, clean, and very permanent. "And the doors?" Wolfe asked Hewitt, who was hovering near a giant potted palm, looking like he might faint. "Bolted from the inside," Hewitt whispered. "I had to use my master key to get in when he didn't show up for our pre-dinner drinks. The windows are all sealed for orchid climate control. No one could have left this way. Wolfe turned his head slowly, surveying the room. His eyes skipped over the exotic flora and landed on a small, wrought-iron table near the body. On it sat a single glass of water, half empty, and a small pillbox made of silver. Archie, the pillbox. I moved closer, being careful where I stepped. I used a handkerchief to flip the lid. Inside were 3 white tablets. Looks like aspirin or maybe something for the heart. No smell coming from the box itself. The glass, Wolfe commanded. I leaned over the water. Nothing. Then I leaned over Sanborn's mouth. The almond scent was stronger there. He didn't get it from the water, or if he did, the evidence went down the hatch. But there's something else, Wolfe. Look at his left hand. Underneath the man's left palm, partially obscured by the marble chips, was a small, crumpled piece of parchment. It looked like a fragment of a botanical tag, the kind Hewitt used to label his prize winners. "Leave it," Wolfe said. He turned his back and looked at Hewitt. "You have guests in the house, Lewis, aside from the deceased." "4," Hewitt said, wiping his brow. "My niece, Elena. My business manager, Julian Thorne. A rival of Sanborn's named Marcus Vanhee arrived uninvited this afternoon to protest the merger, and my head gardener, Ben Holloway. They are all in the drawing room waiting for dinner. They don't know yet. They will know shortly," Wolfe said, his voice regaining its accustomed authority. "Archie, secure this room. Lock the doors and keep the key. We will join the others. If I am to be deprived of Fritz Duck, I will at least have the satisfaction of observing the people who have made my evening so intolerable." I followed them, locking the heavy doors behind me. As we walked toward the drawing room, I could hear the faint sound of a piano being played somewhere in the house's sharp, nervous melody that stopped abruptly as we entered the main hall. The suspects were lined up like pins in a bowling alley, and I could tell by the way Wolfe squared his shoulders that he was already looking for the ball. The sanctity of the evening was gone, replaced by the cold, calculated tension that always preceded a Wolfe interrogation. He didn't look like a man out of his element anymore. He looked like a predator who had finally found a scent worth following. The drawing room of the Hewitt estate was large enough to house a small battalion, but the 4 people huddled near the fireplace looked like they were trying to occupy as little space as possible. As Wolfe and I entered, followed by a ghostly-looking Hewitt, the atmosphere shifted from nervous anticipation to outright frost. Wolfe didn't wait for an introduction. He marched to the largest chair in the roomer wingback, upholstered in gold brocade, claimed it as his throne. He sat, adjusted his bulk, and rested his hands on the gilded arms, his eyes scanning the group with the clinical detachment of a man inspecting a tray of questionable hors d'oeuvres. "This," Hewitt stammered, gesturing toward us, "is Mr. Nero Wolfe, and his assistant, Mr. Archie Goodwin. They are here at my request." A man standing by the mantelpiece, clutching a crystal glass of what looked like straight gin, snorted. This was Marcus Vane, the rival Hewitt had mentioned. He was tall, whip-thin, and had the kind of face that looked like it had been sharpened on a whetstone. The detective, "Good God, Lewis, has it come to that? Is the merger so precarious that you need a private investigator to vet the contracts?" "Mr. Sanborn is dead," Wolfe said. He didn't raise his voice, but the room went so quiet you could hear the logs shifting in the grate. "He is currently lying in the conservatory. He was poisoned. The doors were bolted. I am here to ensure that the police, when they are eventually summoned, find the situation resolved." The reaction was a study in human frailty. A young woman sitting on the sofa, whom I pegged as Hewitt's niece, Elena, let out a sharp, choked gasp and pressed her knuckles to her teeth. She was pretty in a fragile, expensive way, wearing a silk dress the color of a bruised plum. Next to her, a man in a conservative grey suit, Julian Thorne, the business manager, didn't move a muscle, but his face went the color of unbaked dough. "Dead?" Thorne whispered. "But I saw him only an hour ago. He was perfectly fine. He was going to sign the memorandum after dinner." "He won't be signing anything now," I remarked, leaning against the doorframe to keep an eye on the exits. "Unless they have very specific provisions for the afterlife." "And who are you?" the 4th party member spoke. This was Ben Holloway, the head gardener. He was shorter than the others, with skin tanned to the texture of a baseball glove and hands that looked like they spent more time in the dirt than in a pair of gloves. He was standing near the terrace doors, looking like he wanted to bolt. Why are we being kept here? If there's been a death, call the law and let us go to our rooms. You will stay, Wolfe snapped. Mr. Sanborn died in a locked environment. That implies a degree of intimacy with the premises and the victim that is suggestive. Mr. Thorne, you were his business manager. What was the nature of your disagreement this afternoon? Thorne blinked, his eyes darting to Hewitt. Disagreement? There was no disagreement. We were finalizing the Hewitt Mill assessment. It was a standard procedure. Liar, Vane barked, taking a heavy swallow of his drink. I heard you through the library door, Julian. You were pleading with him. You told him that if he went through with the audit, you'd be ruined. Sanborn laughed at you. He had a very distinctive laugh-like gravel in a blender. Thorne's jaw tightened. I was discussing my commission. It's a private matter. And you, Mr. Vane? Wolfe's eyes turned to the rival. You arrived uninvited. A desperate gesture for a man of your standing, surely. Did you come to plead or to threaten? Vane's thin lips curled. I came to offer a counter-proposal. Sanborn was a predator, Wolfe. He didn't build companies, he gutted them. If he had taken the Hewitt Mills, 3,000 people would have been out of work by Christmas. I wanted to prevent a massacre. If he's dead, I won't pretend to weep, but I didn't kill him. I don't use poison. I use hostile takeovers. And the niece? I asked, looking at Elena. You look like you've seen a ghost, or maybe just a very inconvenient corpse. Elena looked up, her eyes brimming with tears that didn't quite fall. He was going to tell my uncle about the debt. I asked him for a loan months ago, a personal matter. He told me tonight that if I didn't support the merger, he'd tell Lewis I was a gambler and a failure. He was a horrible, cruel man. A room full of motives, I muttered to Wolfe. Wolfe grunted, a sound of deep dissatisfaction. And a gardener who knows every inch of the conservatory, the properties of every pesticide, and the location of every bolt. Mr. Holloway, did you attend to the plants this afternoon? Holloway wiped his hands on his trousers. I was in the East Wing. I didn't go near the conservatory after 3 o'clock. Ask anyone. I shall, Wolfe said. He closed his eyes, a sign that he was done with foreplay. Archie, take notes. I want a timeline of every movement in this house since 4 o'clock. And Lewis tell the cook to keep the coffee hot. We are far from finished. The suspects looked at each other, the suspicion in the room now so thick it was a physical weight. They were no longer a group of dinner guests, they were a circle of predators, and Wolfe was the only one who knew which one had already bitten. I moved out of the drawing room with the grace of a cat that had just spotted a particularly interesting mouse hole. Wolfe was settled into his gold brocade throne, and while he looked like he was drifting off into a nap, I knew his brain was spinning at about 10,000 revolutions per minute. My job was to fuel that engine. I started in the kitchen, because in a house this size, the help usually knows who's been sleeping, who's been shouting, and who's been sneaking around with a bottle of cyanide. The kitchen was a cavernous affair that smelled of roasted meat and despair. Fritz would have been appalled by indiscipline. The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Miller, was sitting at a prep table with her head in her hands. I gave her my most sympathetic Archie Goodwin smileth one that usually gets me the last piece of pea and started asking about the afternoon's traffic. It turned out the house had been busier than Grand Central Station. Julian Thorne had been seen pacing the hallway outside Sanborn's room around 4:30, looking like he wanted to jump out of his skin. Elena, the niece, had been spotted in the library crying over a glass of sherry. I thanked Mrs. Miller and headed for the East Wing to find Ben Holloway's quarters. The gardener's shed was attached to the back of the house, and it smelled of peat moss, fertilizer, and wood smoke. I didn't find Holloway there, but I did find his boots. They were caked in white marble chips, the exact same kind that lined the paths in the conservatory. That went into my mental notebook under the heading interesting if true. Holloway had claimed he hadn't been near the conservatory since 3, but those chips were fresh. I circled back toward the library, which sat directly across from the conservatory entrance. The carpet was thick and the shadows were long. I was looking for a vantage point when I saw Marcus Vane. He wasn't in the drawing room anymore. He was lingering near the library door, looking through a crack into the hallway. He didn't see me. I've spent years learning how to walk on eggs without waking the chickens, and I managed to get close enough to see what he was looking at. He was staring at a conservatory door, his face twisted into an expression that was half fear and half fascination. When I cleared my throat, he nearly jumped out of his expensive skin. "Checking the locks, Mr. Vane?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "I was looking for a cigar," he snapped, recovering his composure with a speed that suggested he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. "This house is a tomb, Goodwin. Hewitt is a fool, and Sanborn was a tyrant. I'm wondering how long your employer intends to keep us as prisoners. As long as it takes to find out who turned the dinner party into a wake," I told him. "By the way, did you happen to see Julian Thorne near the conservatory around 5? Someone mentioned he was looking for a private word with the deceased." Vane's eyes narrowed. "I saw Thorne. He was arguing with Sanborn earlier in the afternoon, yes. But at 5? I was in my room trying to make sense of a balance sheet that Sanborn had mangled. If you're looking for a murderer, look at the man who has the most to lose. Thorne's been skimming from the Hewitt accounts for years. Sanborn found out. That's why Thorne was pleading." I left Vane to his cigar and decided to do a little more legwork on the second floor. I ducked into Thorne's room while he was still downstairs. It was a neat, orderly room, but the wastebasket held a crumpled-up telegram from a brokerage firm in London. I smoothed it out. It was a margin call, a big one. It seemed Julian Thorne was playing the market with money he didn't have, and the bill had finally come due. Finally, I made my way to Elena's suite. I didn't go in a gentleman, after all, but I did notice something on the hall floor just outside her door. It was a small, dried leaf, translucent and strange. I am no Theodore Horstman, but I'd spent enough time in Wolfe's plant rooms to recognize a petal from a ghost orchid. They were Hewitt's pride and joy, kept in a special pressurized case in the center of the conservatory. If Elena had a petal on her rug, she'd been inside that room much later than she'd admitted. I headed back to the drawing room, my pockets full of metaphorical dynamite. Wolfe was still in his chair, his eyes closed, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. He didn't open his eyes when I sat opposite him, but I knew he heard me. "The report, Archie," he murmured. "The gardener has marble chips on his shoes, the business manager is broke and skimming, the rival is playing Peeping Tom, and the niece has been stealing petals from the prize orchids," I said, leaning back. "It's a regular festival of honesty, Wolfe. Everyone's lying about where they were, and everyone had a reason to want Sanborn to stop breathing." Wolfe opened one eye. "And the almond scent, still there," I said. "But I found something else. Silver pillbox in Sanborn's pocket. It's empty. The one on the table was a decoy." Wolfe's lips began to move. He was satisfied. "The stage is set, Archie. Now we wait for the trespass." The house had settled into that brand of silence you only find in places where someone has recently stopped breathing. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was the kind of silence that has teeth. Wolfe had requested coffee, and Hewitt, moving like a man in a trance, had seen to it. We were back in the salon, but the mood had shifted. The suspects were no longer huddled together for warmth, they had drifted to separate corners of the room, eyeing one another like passengers on a lifeboat who were weighing the benefits of throwing someone overboard. I was standing by the window, watching the moonlight play over the glass roof of the conservatory in the distance, when I noticed a flicker of movement in the hallway. It was subtly a shadow detaching itself from the dark oak paneling. I didn't reach for the holster under my arm, but I shifted my weight. In this business, you learn that the person who moves in the dark usually has a very good reason for avoiding the light. "Archie," Wolfe said. He didn't turn his head. He was staring at a painting of a dead pheasant on the far wall, but his ears were tuned to the house. "Go and see what has been disturbed." I didn't ask how he knew. When you live with a man who can deduce a person's genealogy from the way they clear their throat, you stop asking for the blueprints. I slipped out of the room and headed toward the back of the house. I wasn't making a sound, but I could hear someone else who wasn't being quite as successful. A floorboard creaked near the library. Then came the unmistakable clink of glass hitting glass. I rounded the corner and saw the door to the small service pantry standing ajar. I didn't rush in. I waited, counting to 10, then entered the frame. Ben Holloway, the gardener, was standing by the spice rack, his hand trembling as he held a small, dark blue bottle. He looked at me, and for a second I thought he was going to bolt through the window. "A bit late for seasoning, isn't it?" I asked. Holloway nearly dropped the bottle. "It's not. It's for the roses, a specific mixture." I realized I'd left it out of the shed. In the pantry, I stepped closer. Last time I checked, roses didn't have much use for McCormick's cinnamon. "What's in the bottle, Ben?" I took it from his hand before he could decide whether to fight or fly. It wasn't a spice jar. It was a professional-grade botanical concentrate, labeled in Hewitt's elegant, cramped handwriting. But there was a smudge on the label, a reddish-brown smear that looked suspiciously like the marble dust ID seen on his boots. More importantly, the seal had been broken. "I didn't kill him," Holloway whispered, his voice cracking, "but I saw who did it, or I saw who was there. I was coming back from the east wing and I saw the door closing. I thought it was Mr. Hewitt. I didn't want to get in trouble for being out of my station, so I stayed in the shadows. But then I found this in the path after you all left. It doesn't belong in the conservatory, then why hide it?" I asked. "Because it's mine," he hissed. "It's a pesticide we use for scale insects on orchids. It's lethal, Mr. Goodwin. If the police found it near the body, they wouldn't look at the fancy guests. They'd look at the man who handles the poison every day." I told him to stay put and took the bottle back to the drawing room. When I walked in, I didn't lead with the bottle. I looked at the coffee table where the silver pillbox ID seen earlier was sitting. It had been moved, only an inch or two, but on a polished mahogany surface, an inch is as good as a mile. I looked at Wolfe and gave him a short, sharp nod. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. He looked at Julian Thorne, then at Marcus Vane. "It seems," Wolfe remarked, his voice like cold honey, "that our murderer is not only ruthless but also remarkably busy. Someone has been attempting to tidy up. A misplaced bottle of toxin, a shifted pillbox, a frantic search for a missing monogram. It is a pity. I find that when people try to erase their tracks, they only succeed in making the mud deeper." "What are you talking about?" Thorne demanded, his voice high and tight. "We've been sitting right here." "Not all of you," I said, holding up the blue bottle. "And not all at once. Someone took a little trip to the pantry, and someone else took a very keen interest in that pillbox while I was in the kitchen." The tension in the room snapped. Elena began to sob quietly into a handkerchief, and Vane stood up, his face a mask of cold fury. "This is absurd. We are being toyed with by a man who is too lazy to even stand up and look at the evidence himself." Wolfe didn't blink. "I do not need to stand, Mr. Vane. The truth has a way of gravitating toward the center of the room if you wait long enough. Archie, call Mr. Saul Panzer. Tell him I have a specific errand regarding the London brokerage firm we discussed, and tell him to hurry. I would like to be home in time for breakfast." I headed for the telephone in the hall, knowing that the trespass had given Wolfe exactly what he needed. The suspects were starting to crack, and when they did, the noise was going to be loud enough to wake the dead man in the conservatory. I went to the alcove in the hall and picked up the receiver. Calling Saul Panzer at that hour usually meant catching him in the middle of a hand of pinochle, or just as he was settling in with a book. But Saul is like a volunteer fireman. He's always ready for the bell. I gave him the name of the London brokerage firm ID seen on the telegram in Thorne's room, and told him Wolfe needed the full weather report on their recent margin calls. Saul didn't ask why. He just said, "Right, Archie," and hung up. He's the best operative in the business because he has the memory of an elephant and the invisibility of a ghost. When I returned to the drawing room, the seating chart had changed again. Julian Thorne was pacing a tight circuit behind the sofa, his hands shoved so deep into his pockets he looked like he was trying to reach his knees. Marcus Vane was back by the gin, though he was nursing it now rather than gulping. Elena had stopped crying and was staring into the fire with a hollow expression that made her look 10 years older. Wolfe was leaning back, his eyes half closed, but his fingers were doing a slow, rhythmic tap on the arms of his chair. That's a bad sign for whoever is on his list. It means he's found the thread and is just waiting for the right moment to yank it. "Lewis," Wolfe said, addressing Hewitt without opening his eyes, "you mentioned that Mr. Sanborn was alone in the conservatory. How long was the interval between his entry and your discovery of the inconvenience?" Hewitt swallowed hard. 30 minutes, perhaps 40. He said he wanted to see Ghost Orchid by moonlight. He said it was the only thing in the house with a colder soul than his own. He was joking, of course. At least I thought he was. And the doors? Wolfe's voice was a mere murmur. As I said, Nero. Bolted. I had to use my master key. Ben holds the only other key. I cleared my throat. About that, Wolfe. Ben's been doing some moonlight strolling of his own. I found him in the pantry trying to stash a bottle of cyanide-based pesticide. He claims he found it in the conservatory path after we arrived and panicked because it was his. The silence that followed was heavy. Thorne stopped pacing. He found it, or he dropped it. A gardener would hardly leave his tools at the scene of a crime, Wolfe remarked, finally opening his eyes. They were bright and hard. A gardener knows the potency of his stock. If Mr. Holloway intended to kill, he would have ensured the vessel vanished entirely. To leave it on a path is either an act of incredible incompetence or a deliberate plan by someone who wishes us to look at the soil rather than the ceiling. Suddenly, the telephone in the hall rang. I went to get it. It was Saul. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He gave me 3 numbers and a name. I scribbled them on my pad, said thanks, and walked back into the room. I didn't say a word. I just handed the slip of paper to Wolfe. Wolfe adjusted his spectacles and peered at my handwriting. He grunted. It was a sound of grim satisfaction. Thank you, Archie. It seems the London fog is clearing. He turned his gaze toward Julian Thorne. The business manager froze. Mr. Thorne, you have had a difficult month. The market is a cruel mistress, especially when one is using funds that belong to a textile conglomerate to cover personal losses in overseas speculation. Mr. Sanborn was not merely here for a merger, he was here for an audit. He had discovered the discrepancy, hadn't he? Thorne's face didn't just go pale, it went grey. Tuts, that's a lie. I don't know what your man found, but it's a mistake. It is never a mistake, Wolfe snapped, but you are not alone under pressure. Mr. Vane, your counter-proposal was not a merger at all. It was a plea for a stay of execution. Sanborn held notes on your personal properties. If he died, those notes would pass into the hands of his estate, buying you months of time. And Miss Eleneu spoke of gambling debts. Sanborn was going to use those debts to force your uncle into a sale he did not want. All of you had motives that were not just financial, but existential. But the room was locked. Elena cried. How could any of us have done it? Wolfe leaned forward, his bulk shifting with a sudden dangerous energy. That is the beauty of a trap, Miss Hewitt. It does not require the trapper to be present when the spring is released. It only requires a moment of preparation and a victim who is a creature of habit. Mr. Sanborn took a pill for his heart every evening at 7. He did so with a glass of water, a very specific glass, in a very specific place. Wolfe looked at the silver pillbox on the table. Archie, the pressure is increasing. I believe it is time we move from observation to intervention. We shall have one more guest join us. Mr. Holloway, come in. Holloway shuffled into the room looking like he was heading for the gallows. But as he entered, I noticed Marcus Vane's hand tighten around his gin glass until his knuckles turned white. The air in the room was suddenly charged, as if a thunderstorm was about to break right over the Hewitt carpet. Wolfe did not rise, but he seemed to expand, his presence filling the drawing room until the high ceilings felt cramped. He was no longer a guest, he was the director of a play that had reached its most critical transition. He sat with his chin tucked into his collar, his eyes moving with agonizing slowness from one face to another. He was positioning his players, and he was doing it with the cold-blooded efficiency of a grandmaster arranging a checkmate 3 moves before the opponent even realizes the game is lost. We find ourselves in a curious position, Wolfe began, his voice dropping to a low, hypnotic register. A man is dead in a room that was sealed. To the imaginative mind, this suggests magic. To the logical mind, it suggests a sequence of events that began long before the door was bolted. Mr. Sanborn was a man of rigid routinier trait that is often a virtue in finance, but a fatal flaw in a house full of enemies. He took his medication at 7. He preferred the humidity of the conservatory to the library's dry air, and he was a man who could not resist the urge to correct a perceived disorder. Wolfe gestured toward Holloway, who was standing by the door looking like he wanted to melt into the woodwork. Mr. Holloway, you are a gardener of some repute. Tell me, what happens to a ghost orchid if the humidity drops by even 10%? Holloway blinked, surprised by the shift in topic. "It wilts, sir. Petals lose translucence within minutes. It's a very delicate balance." "Precisely," Wolfe murmured. "And if a guest, perhaps one with a superficial interest in botany, were to see a petal on the floor, or a valve out of place, they might be tempted to intervene, especially if they believed they were helping preserve a masterpiece. Mr. Vane, you have spent much of the evening discussing your disdain for Mr. Sanborn. Yet, when Archie saw you in the hallway, you were not looking for a cigar. You were staring at the conservatory door with the intensity of a man waiting for a ghost to emerge." Vane's face stiffened. "I was contemplating the irony of the situation, Wolfe. Nothing more." "Irony is a poor shield for a guilty conscience," Wolfe countered. "You knew Sanborn's habits. You knew he took his heart medication with water. But you also knew something else. You knew Mr. Thorne had been skimming. You saw an opportunity to remove a rival and cast the blame on a desperate man. You didn't need to enter the room after it was locked. You only needed to ensure that the bait was taken." Wolfe turned his gaze to the table. "Archie, the pillbox." I stepped forward and picked up the silver box I had moved earlier. "Still empty, Wolfe. But the residue at the bottom has a very interesting color when you hold it up to the light." "It is not a residue of aspirin," Wolfe said, his voice sharpening. "It is a concentrated alkaloid, masked by the scent of the very pesticide Mr. Holloway was so keen to hide. The trick was not in the poison itself, but in the delivery. Someone encouraged Mr. Sanborn to visit the conservatory. Someone suggested the light was perfect for the orchids. And someone ensured that the water he used to take his pill was not water at all, but a solution prepared in advance." "You're guessing," Thorne shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You have no proof of any of this." "I have proof of human behavior," Wolfe said, "and I have the telegram Saul Panzer investigated. But more importantly, I have the reaction of the person who, just moments ago, realized that the second pillbox, the one they switched in a moment of panissis, currently in Archie's pocket. The trespass the first mentioned earlier was not just a search for a bottle. It was a desperate attempt to retrieve the evidence of a botched substitution." Wolfe leaned back, his eyes snapping shut. "I am tired. This house is draughty, and the coffee is beginning to taste of the pot. Archie, I believe we have seen enough of the salon. It is time for a formal gathering. We shall meet in the library in 10 minutes. I want the master key, the blue bottle, and the silver box on the table, and Louisshave the butler bring a tray of sandwiches. If I am to deliver a murderer to the authorities, I refuse to do it on an empty stomach." As Wolfe signaled the end of the session, I watched the suspects. They weren't looking at Wolfe anymore. They were looking at each other, the suspicion finally turning into a tangible, poisonous dread. Wolfe had positioned them exactly where he wanted, in a state of absolute, shivering uncertainty. They were ready for the office gathering, even if they didn't know it yet. The library of the Hewitt estate was a room designed to make a man feel small, filled with leather-bound volumes of dead authors and the heavy silence of old money. Wolfe had reclaimed his position in a large chair near the mahogany desk, looking as though he had been part of the furniture for centuries. He had a plate of ham sandwiches in front of him, and he was working through them with a focus that suggested the death of a financier was a distant second to the quality of the mustard. The suspects stood or sat in a semicircle, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the sharp, ozone tang of a brewing storm. "We are here," Wolfe began, after swallowing a final bite of ham and dabbing his lips with a linen handkerchief, "because a murder was committed with a degree of arrogance that is almost as offensive as the crime itself." The locked room was a theatrical flourish, a curtain drawn to hide a very simple stagehand's trick. You all had motives. Mr. Thorne, your embezzlement was a ticking clock. Miss Elena, your debts were a chain around your neck. Mr. Vane, your business was a sinking ship. Any of you might have struck, but only one of you had the cold, clinical patience to turn a man's own health into a weapon. Wolfe gestured toward the items on the desk, the blue bottle, the silver pillbox, and the fragment of the botanical tag ID recovered earlier. The poison was indeed a cyanide-based pesticide, as Mr. Holloway feared, but it was not administered by spray or needle. It was placed inside a gelatin capsule, which was then substituted for Mr. Sanborn's heart medication. The beauty of a capsule is its delay. It provides the killer with the one thing they crave most, an alibi. The murderer didn't need to be in the conservatory when Sanborn died. They only needed to be the one who kindly checked on the supply of pills in his room earlier that afternoon. That could have been anyone, Julian Thorne said, though his voice lacked conviction. No, Wolfe snapped, his eyes flashing, because the killer made a fatal error born of vanity. They didn't just want Sanborn dead, they wanted to frame Mr. Hewitt. By placing the bottle on the path and ensuring the death happened in the conservatory, they sought to implicate the host. But in their haste to arrange the scene, they dropped something. Archie, the tag. I stepped forward and held up the small piece of parchment. It's a labeling tag for a ghost orchid. But look at the back. There's a faint impression of a Fountain Pena signature being practiced. Julian Thorne. It seems someone was using the back of a discarded tag to perfect a forgery, likely for the merger documents Sanborn was set to sign. Thorne lunged for the desk, but I was faster. I had him by the arm before he could reach the paper. The look of pure animal terror on his face told the rest of the story. He collapsed back into his chair, the defiance leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. You were the only one with access to his personal effects in the city, and here, Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble of judgment. You knew his dosage, you knew his timing. You prepared the capsule in advance, hoping that by the time the poison acted, you would be miles away or surrounded by witnesses in this room. The locked door was an accident of Sanborn's own macking sought privacy for his final moments of life, not knowing he was sealing his own tomb. Your attempt to retrieve the pillbox tonight after realizing you had left a trace of the pesticide on the lid was the final act of a desperate man. Thorne didn't speak. He just stared at the floor, his hands trembling. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind rattling the library windows. Hewitt looked at his business manager with a mixture of pity and horror. Archie, Wolfe said, his tone shifting back to its usual briskness. Call the authorities. Tell them to bring a van. And tell them to be quick about it. I have a garden of my own that requires my attention, and I have had quite enough of this one. 2 hours later, after the police had taken Thorne away, and the Hewitt household had settled into a grim, exhausted peace, we were back in the sedan. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, painting the New York skyline in shades of bruised orange and gold. Wolfe sat in the back, his eyes closed, seemingly asleep. A tidy piece of work, Wolfe, I said, steering the car onto the West Side Highway. Though I think you just did it for the Albuquerque Hewitt promised you. A man must be compensated for his discomfort, Archie, Wolfe murmured, without opening his eyes. Mr. Thorne was a fool. He thought that by controlling the environment he could control the outcome. He forgot that the most dangerous element in any garden is the person who thinks they are the only one who knows where the weeds are buried. Human folly is the only thing that grows faster than a weed, and it is far more difficult to prune. Right, I said, hitting the gas as we neared 35th Street. And next time someone invites us for dinner, I am checking the menu for cyanide first. Wolfe didn't answer. He was already thinking about breakfast, and in the brownstone that was the only thing that truly mattered. The sun was just beginning to highlight the grime on the windshield of the sedan as we crossed back into Manhattan. The city was waking up, but after a night spent in the company of a corpse and a collection of high-strung millionaires, the early morning commuters looked remarkably refreshed to me. In the back seat, Wolfe was a silent, yellow-shirted monument to exhaustion. He hadn't moved a muscle since Wed cleared the Yonkers city limits, but I knew better than to think he was actually resting. He was likely mentally cataloguing every calorie he had missed during the ordeal and planning a retaliatory strike against the kitchen the moment we stepped through the door. When I finally pulled up in front of the brownstone on West 35th Street, the sight of the familiar stoop felt like a personal victory. I cut the engine, and for a moment, the silence was absolute. Even the city seemed to hold its breath. "We're home, boss," I said, stretching my arms until my joints popped like dry kindling. Safe, sound, and only 12 hours late for bed, Wolfe opened his eyes. He didn't look at the house, he looked at his watch. "It is 7:14, Archie. Fritz will be preparing the sourdough for the breakfast rolls. I expect he is perplexed by our absence." "He's probably got a search party out by now," I told him. opening the door for him. It took a fair amount of maneuvering, but eventually Wolfe stood on the sidewalk, adjusted his vest, and took a deep breath of the New York air which, compared to the scent of cyanide and damp orchids, probably smelled like a spring meadow to him. Inside, the brownstone was warm and smelled of coffee and baking bread. Fritz appeared in the hallway, his face a mixture of relief and professional disapproval. He was wearing his apron and holding a whisk as if it were a scepter. "Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Goodwin," he exclaimed. "I've been hot. I assumed that whatever business took you away would eventually return you with an appetite." "You assumed correctly, Fritz," Wolfe said, heading straight for his oversized chair in the office, as if he hadn't seen it in years. He sat down with a groan of profound satisfaction. "A tragedy has occurred. I have been forced to consume a ham sandwich on white bread. It was a harrowing experience. I shall make amends immediately, sir," Fritz promised, disappearing back into the kitchen with a determined look in his eye. I followed Wolfe into the office and sat at my desk. I pulled the typewriter toward me and inserted a fresh sheet of paper. "I suppose you want the report filed before you head up to the plant rooms at 9. "It can wait until after breakfast," Wolfe muttered. He was staring at the empty space on his desk where a new orchid would soon sit the price of his intervention at the Hewitt estate. "Lewis is mailing Albuquerque this afternoon. See that Theodore is ready for it. It is a temperamental specimen. It'll fit right in here then," I said, starting to peck out the heading of the case report. "You know, Wolfe, Thorne almost had us. If he hadn't been so greedy about trying to frame Hewitt, he might have walked away with the whole textile company in his pocket." Wolfe grunted, a short, sharp sound. "Greed is a common enough motive, Archie, but it is rarely the most dangerous one. It was his lack of respect for the process that undid him. He treated murder as a financial transaction, something to be balanced on a ledger. He forgot that a crime is not a calculation, it is a rupture in the social fabric. He expected the world to remain orderly while he introduced chaos. It is a paradox that the criminal mind rarely resolves." "Well, he's got plenty of time to work on his math in Sing Sing," I said. "And Vane? Do you think Hell survived the merger?" "Mr. Vane has the survival instincts of a cockroach in a sugar refinery," Wolfe said, his voice regaining its usual resonance. "He will find a way to profit from the wreckage. He is a man of little character, but great persistence. I find him infinitely less interesting than a well-grown bulb." Fritz appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray that could have fed a small army. There were poached eggs, kidneys in wine sauce, and rolls that looked like they had been blessed by a higher power. Wolfe's eyes brightened. For a moment, the dead guest in the conservatory and the desperate man in the library were forgotten. "Archie," Wolfe said, picking up his fork with the solemnity of a priest, "in the future, if Mr. Hewitt calls with an invitation to dinner, tell him I am indisposed. Or better yet, tell him I am dead. It would be less taxing." "You got it, boss," I said, reaching for a roll. But keeping the car gassed up, just in case. Wolfe didn't answer. He was busy with the kidneys, and the silence of the brownstone was finally restored. It was a silence earned through logic, luck, and a very large amount of stubbornness. It was exactly the way things were supposed to be. The office was finally back to its proper state of equilibrium. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with a rhythmic precision that seemed to mock the frantic events of the previous evening. Wolfe was behind his desk, having finished a breakfast that would have incapacitated a lesser mortal, and was now occupied with the morning mail. He used his gold letter opener with the surgical delicacy of a man who understood that even a bill from the power company deserved a certain level of decorum. The sunlight was streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air, seemingly indifferent to the fact that the world outside was still churning with its usual brand of malice and stupidity. I sat at my desk, the typewriter clacking away as I finished the final page of the report. I like to get the details down while they're still fresh, before the names of the suspects start to blur into the long list of people who thought they were smarter than the man in the oversized chair. I reached the part about the silver pillbox and the residue of the pesticide, and paused, looking over at Wolfe. "You know," I said, leaning back and lighting a cigarette, "there's one thing that still bothers me. Thorne was a professional manager. He dealt with risks for a living. Why on earth would he try to fetch that pillbox while we were still in the house? It was the only thing that actually tied him to the physical act of poisoning. Wolfe didn't look up from his correspondence. Because Archie, he was a victim of his own expertise. In business, a mistake can often be corrected by a swift, decisive action, a late-night edit, to a contract or a whispered word to a board member. He could refuse that. In a murder investigation, the evidence is immutable once it has been observed. He believed that if he could simply reach the object, he could erase the reality of his crime. It is a common delusion among the white-collar class. They believe the world is made of paper, and paper can always be shredded. I guess he found out the hard way that marble chips and cyanide don't shred so easily, I remarked. And Hewitt? He called 10 minutes ago while you were finishing your second cup of coffee. He sounded like a man who had just survived a shipwreck and wasn't quite sure why he was still dry. Mr. Hewitt is a man of delicate sensibilities, Wolfe said, finally setting down a letter and looking at me. He is haunted by the idea that his sanctuary was used as a slaughterhouse. He will spend the next 6 months purging the conservatory, replacing every plant that might have bore witness to Mr. Sanborn's expiration. It is a waste of perfectly good flora, but as I have often observed, the wealthy prefer to prune their memories rather than their habits. He also mentioned the courier is on his way with the albuca, I added. He said it's the finest specimen he's ever grown. I think he's trying to buy back your good graces for making you Miss Fritz duck. Wolfe's lips did a brief, subtle Danse's version of a triumphant smile. The albuca is a fair trade for a night of discomfort. However, let it be known that my good graces are not a commodity. I provided a service. I solved a problem that the police would have likely bungled into a national scandal, and I did so while suffering the indignity of a country house armchair. The plant is not a gift, it is a restitution. Sure, I said, pulling the last page from the typewriter. Call it what you want. I call it a lucky break for orchids. At least here it won't have to watch any more financiers keel over during the cocktail hour. Fritz entered the room, his expression now one of serene professionalism. He carried a small tray with 2 glasses of beer. He placed one in front of Wolfe and the other on the edge of my desk. In brownstone, it was equivalent to a ceasefire being signed. Thank you, Fritz, Wolfe said, his voice softening. He picked up the glass, admiring the head on the beer before taking a long, appreciative swallow. He let out a sigh that seemed to originate from his toes. Archie, once you have filed that report, you may take the afternoon off. I believe you have a date with a young lady who enjoys dancing in rooms with far too much noise and far too little ventilation. Lily Rowan, I said, grinning, and she doesn't just enjoy it, she treats it like a competitive sport. Are you sure you can spare me? What if another millionaire drops dead in a locked room before dinner? Wolfe looked at the clock. It was nearly 9. The orchids were waiting. If the King of England himself were to expire in a locked room between now and 4 o'clock, he would simply have to wait. I have spent enough time dealing with the follies of the living. I prefer the company of beings that do not lie, do not embezzle, and do not require me to leave my house. He stood up, his massive frame rising with a slow, deliberate dignity. He headed for the elevator, his shirts yellow bright against the dark wood of the office. Just as the door was about to slide shut, he looked back at me. And Archie? See, the beer is chilled for tonight. I suspect Albuquerque's arrival will require some celebration. It is, after all, a guest that knows how to behave. The elevator door closed with a soft click. I picked up my beer, toasted the empty chair, and decided that for once the boss was right. The world was a mess, but as long as the beer was cold and the orchids were blooming, we could manage to keep the chaos on the other side of the front door.